Alright, in this video, I'm going to do a spark plug change on my 2013 Mazda 3. An astute viewer may recognize that this was one of my first videos I ever made, but I'm going to make this one better with better quality audio and better camera work. Some of the things I'm going to use here is a torque wrench, specifically one that goes at around 12 foot-pounds. I've got a spark plug socket, so it's a little deeper than a regular socket, has a little plastic thing inside. This is 14 millimeter or 9/16. So the 9/16 is a little bit bigger, so the 14 mil does seem a little bit loose on the spark plugs, but it works. I've still got the dielectric grease from the first time I've done a spark plug change on this vehicle. I got some Q-tips, and I got a 10 millimeter socket on a short ratchet. I've got a larger ratchet. Obviously, I've got 4 spark plugs because it's a 4-cylinder. These are ILKAR 7L11, which is the 94124 spark plug. And I've got a spark plug gapping gauge. These are the Iridium spark plugs, and you can see what a new one looks like out of the box. Again, it's an NGK branded plug. You can see what it is right there, stamped on it. And I've got the original spark plugs that I pulled out of the Mazda the first time, and you can see it says Mazda on there. And if you look in the manual, you'll see that PE5 number. And if you look at the back of the plug, ILKAR 7L11. So they are the same plugs, and really I'm just going to replace the NGK plugs that I put in 140,000 kilometers ago with these new NGK plugs. So pretty straightforward change. I paid $100 for all 4 plugs. Mazda wanted $50 per plug, so that's $200. And then they also wanted $250 to change the plugs after tax. Mazda is going to charge you about $500, give or take, in Canada. And you could do this for $100 or less. If you go to Rock Auto, I found that they had the cheapest parts, but I went to Canadian Tire. Now, before I do anything, I'm gonna check the gap on all of the plugs. And it is important to check the gap on all the plugs because you can't change the gap on these Iridium plugs. You would just have to return them if it's way out of spec. These ones are all good, so I'm gonna go ahead with it. Now to get into this job, I'm gonna lift up on the front end of the engine cover and pull it straight back. You can see that there's 2 receptors on the back of the engine cover, and they go onto these, I guess, engine cover studs. Just slide right on. And then to get this bracket off, there's 5 bolts that hold it down. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1 down low, number 5, and they're all 10 millimeter. I didn't find a requirement for any penetrating spray or anything like that. They're very easy to break free, and once they're broken free, you could just quickly take them off by hand. No big deal, super easy to do. Once all 5 of those bolts are off, that mounting bracket, which really just holds down the ignition coils as well as hold on the engine cover, should just lift straight up and out. So there's the 5 bolts, and then obviously the bracket was in my hand. Now there's only 1 bolt that holds down each of the ignition coils, and then there's 1 electrical connector on each of the ignition coils. You may be able to just pull the coil out without disconnecting the electrical connector, but I found it's pretty easy to get those electrical connectors off. For these, you may need a deeper socket because obviously that bolt is longer. And again, like I said, it's a 10 millimeter, so you just need to break it free. And I would recommend pulling off the electrical connector while it's still bolted down to the vehicle, because then it won't flop around. I do take a second to get some of the debris off the top of the engine. Really, I just don't want things falling into the spark plug well once I have the ignition coil off. And one thing to note, I do remove these all one at a time and then do the install one at a time as well. I don't take them all out and leave the spark plug wells exposed because I don't want anything dropping in there. These bolts are a little bit strange. It's kind of like a bolt with a screw on either end. Once that bolt is removed, the ignition coil should pull straight back and out. Now, with the spark plug socket on a socket extension, I'll carefully feed it down into the hole until I feel it engage onto the spark plug, and then I'm just going to use the regular ratchet to remove the spark plug from the spark plug well, and it's just lefty-loosey. Do that a few times, and then you should be able to remove it by hand. Eventually, it shouldn't be stuck in the entire way up. And I did use anti-seize when I put these in. I am not using anti-seize this time. NGK doesn't recommend it for their Iridium plugs. If you want to use it, whatever. Generally speaking, you should reduce the torque spec on the plugs if you're using anti-seize, But in this case, like I said, I'm not, so I'm gonna go 12 foot-pounds. I would say that these old plugs actually look pretty good. And quite frankly, even though they're at 140,000 kilometers, they're probably still good, but I've got the spark plugs, I've got the time, and I do make YouTube videos, so I will install the new spark plugs. But anyway, there's no damage to it. There's no issues with these plugs. They look good. They're just old, coming up on 100,000 miles. And if you compare the old plug to the new plug, it is identical. They're both NGK, so it doesn't have the Mazda branding on it. The only difference I really saw was the old ones that I bought were made in Japan, and the new ones are made in Thailand. So I'll take the new spark plug, again, no anti-seize on it. I'll insert it into the spark plug socket. And I think that this socket also has some sort of magnetic element to it, but it also has that plastic piece so it doesn't damage the spark plug going in. Carefully put the spark plug into the spark plug well and very carefully start tightening it. I don't use a little rubber hose or whatever. I think I've seen that, but just be careful that you don't cross thread the spark plug into the engine. That would be very bad, so be careful, take your time. And like I said, I'm going 12 foot-pounds on this. This is obviously a aluminum head on the engine, and the NGK recommended torque spec for these is 10.8 to 14.5 foot-pounds. My torque wrench is measured in inch-pounds, so I went to 144 inch-pounds, but do not get confused between inch-pounds and foot-pounds when you're doing this. Again, 12 foot-pounds. And obviously I'll use the torque wrench to bring the torque spec to 12 foot-pounds. Now I'm going to put some dielectric grease on one of my wife's Q-tips, smear the dielectric grease into the ignition coil and work it around. The benefit of the dielectric grease is it's clear, so I can just throw it back in my wife's Q-tip box when I'm done. I'll insert the ignition coil back into the engine, obviously making sure it's fully seated. I'll take the bolt that secures the ignition coil to the engine and tighten it back down. I don't have a torque spec on it, but obviously I'll just take the ratchet and tighten it up, and then I will insert the electrical connector back into the ignition coil, and that's it. First one done, and that was pretty much in regular time. I think this job only took me about 45 minutes while filming it, so everything else I'll speed up and get progressively faster. So I'll take that first bolt off the ignition coil and remove the electrical connector, remove the ignition coil from the engine, carefully insert the spark plug socket and extension into the spark plug well and remove it using a ratchet. Once the spark plug is being removed from the engine, I'll give it a quick inspection, make sure there's nothing weird about it, make sure that there's no damage on it, and this one also seems to be fine, no issues. Insert the new spark plug into the spark plug socket, carefully insert the new spark plug into the spark plug well, and tighten it by hand, making sure that I do not cross thread it into the engine block. Again, it's aluminum, it will cause problems if you cross thread it. I'll grab the torque wrench and tighten it to 12 foot-pounds. I'll then take the ignition coil with some dielectric grease and a Q-tip, quickly smear the dielectric grease around in the ignition coil, reinstall the ignition coil into the Mazda, grab the bolt that secures the ignition coil, quickly tighten it by hand. Again, it's a 10 millimeter. And then once the bolt is fully seated, take the electrical connector, plug it in. For number 3, I'll even go slightly faster. Remove the bolt, remove the electrical connector, remove the ignition coil, grab that spark plug socket, insert it in the spark plug well, and remove the spark plug. Once the spark plug has been fully removed from the engine, check it for damage, make sure it's in good condition. I'll set that one aside. I'll grab the new spark plug, carefully insert the new spark plug into the spark plug socket, and lower the spark plug into the spark plug well, tightening it up by hand initially. Again, make sure you don't cross thread it, and then tighten it down to 12 foot-pounds using a torque wrench. Grab that dielectric grease, put it on a Q-tip, work the Q-tip around inside of the ignition coil, reinstall the ignition coil onto the spark plug, tighten the bolt that secures the ignition coil down, and reinstall the electrical connector. And finally, remove the electrical connector, remove the bolt, remove the ignition coil, grab the ratchet, remove the spark plug from the spark plug well, Once again, check it out, make sure there's no damage, make sure that there's nothing strange with the spark plug that you just removed. Grab the new spark plug, put it on the spark plug socket, and again I check the gap on everything at the beginning. I'll carefully tighten the spark plug by hand initially, grab the torque wrench, tighten it down, then go dielectric grease, work it around inside of the ignition coil, reinstall the ignition coil, take that bolt, tighten it down, and then reinsert the electrical connector into the ignition coil. Now I'll take that bracket that I removed initially, the one that kind of holds some of the ignition coils down, but is mainly there to hold the engine cover. Just grab those 5-10 millimeter bolts, put them on, and tighten it down. For this, again, I have no torque spec, but I just tighten it and don't go crazy, but also don't leave them super loose. Now put the engine cover back on. So those two protrusions in the mounting bracket are going to go through those two holes, and then the engine cover just clips down in place. And the real moment of truth is going to be when I start the vehicle, and ideally the car is going to sound just fine, no change, and it does. So when you're putting in new spark plugs, definitely check your manuals, see what they are. There's probably some weird code, so you can look at the different types of codes and stuff for your spark plugs if you're getting a different brand. Just know your numbers. Talk to the dealership, they might know what kind of plugs they are as well. It's a pretty easy job to do by yourself, and if you're going to be able to save $400, in this case Canadian, it is a pretty good savings for something that takes you less than 1 hour and only requires basic tools. Anyway, thanks for checking out my video. Hopefully this was better than the last one. Don't forget to like and subscribe.